Hello everyone and welcome to BSL Talks. I'm Dina Bowman, Principal Research Fellow at the Brotherhood of St Laurence. I'm speaking to you from Wadawurrung country in regional Victoria. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands from which we meet and pay respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today. Before we begin, some housekeeping. Today we have Tyson and Amber as our Auslan interpreters, and Carrie is providing captioning. Please post your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen and comments or questions in the chat. If you tweet, we have the hashtags Anti-Poverty Week and BSL Talks. We should have some time for questions after the main discussion. In previous webinars, we've discussed the intersection of work, care and social security, child poverty and women's economic security. In Anti-Poverty Week, it's timely to focus on the role of family payments, like family tax benefit, in supporting the economic security and financial well-being of families with children. Family tax benefit consists of two parts, Part A and B. Part A is designed to help families with the cost of raising children and is based on the combined income of a family and is paid in respect of each eligible family tax benefit child, while Part B provides extra help for single parent families and couple families with one main income earner. In June 2022, there were around 1.4 million recipients of family tax benefit A, helping to support 2.7 million children. This was down from around 1.5 million recipients in March 2015. There were also almost 1.1 recipients of family tax benefit B, down from 1.3 million in March 2015. 42% of family tax benefit recipients, that's A and B, also receive other income support payments. But this has also fallen. In March 2021, it was 47%. And the value of the payment has also decreased. We're lucky today to have a distinguished panel of experts to tease out the issues and highlight what changes to family payments and related policies are needed so that no child in Australia lives in poverty. We're joined by Professor Miranda Stewart, who joins us from Wurundjeri land. Miranda is a professor at Melbourne Law School, the University of Melbourne. She's also honorary professor at Crawford's School of Public Policy at the ANU, affiliated with the Tax and Transfer Policy Institute. We also are joined by Anne Hollonds, the National Children's Commissioner, who was appointed as Commissioner in 2020. Previously, she was the Director of the Australian Institute of Family Studies, an independent statutory authority of the Australian Government responsible for conducting research and providing advice on child and family wellbeing. We also are joined by Sarah, an advocate by experience, single mum of small children, who'll be able to share her insights and experience. Unfortunately, Sarah's camera's not working, but we're really happy that she can join us. So let's begin the discussion. Miranda, from your perspective, what are the key issues with family tax benefit A and B, and why are they important?
Thanks, Dina. And I'd like to also to acknowledge the lands I'm speaking from, the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. It's great to participate in this panel in Anti-Poverty Week, and an honour to be on the panel with Dina and Anne, and hosted by the Brotherhood and Sarah in particular as well. So family tax benefit A and B are long-standing family payments in our system. You know, they go back to the 1990s, and they have a longer history in the 80s and earlier in sort of child allowances and child payments. A couple of things about those payments that I think are worthy of us looking at today, and that might be problems with the payments. One is that they are quite tightly income tested on joint income of a couple, or of course sole parents' income. The consequence of that means testing means that they're paid to actually less than half of families with children now in Australia. Historically, these payments were universal, and they were sort of a gesture of public policy towards the value of children, sharing the cost of care for children in our society. Another aspect of that we might come back to is that the income testing of these payments can have a kind of operates a bit like a tax rate or a tax on work of parents, and can be a disincentive for workforce participation.
Thanks, Miranda. You described some of the disincentives. Perhaps you could explain that in a bit more detail.
Yes, so these things are always a little complex, but what I thought I would do is share a chart without being too terrifying to try to illustrate the impact. So can I confirm that people are seeing a chart of what we call the effective tax rate? So this is an example, it's what we call a cameo example. It's a hypothetical family, not a real family. And it's an example of a couple family on median wages, male and female median wages, with 2 kids under 5. And the primary earner, you could say, is working full-time. And so this tracks what we call the effective tax rate on the second earner going to work. That's this axis here on the left, from 0 to up to 80%. So that sounds like quite a high tax rate, 80%, doesn't it? So what this shows is that for our second earner to go to work 1 day a week, with the primary earner working full time, usually she faces an effective tax rate of 50% on her work for that 1 day a week. That's a consequence of losing family tax benefit A, which is coloured in sort of pink or orange here, and family tax benefit B. So this family is receiving the family payments and benefiting from them. Those family payments improve the disposable income of this family, and they're an important contribution to the household income. But what happens is that because we means test or income test the payments on the joint income of the family, and we have someone working full-time already, when the second earner starts to work, the wage is sort of on top and faces these high tax rates, the combination of paying some income tax, paying for childcare, net childcare cost, and losing the benefits. So day 2 of work has an effect. She goes to work 2 days a week, effective tax rate of closer to 60%. And the same, so day 3, you can see 50%, day 4, 60, and day 5, 70%. And now she's paying some income tax as well. The green is net childcare cost under current settings. So overall, essentially, our second earner takes away around about 40% of her wages, actually benefits the family, makes the whole family better off when you combine all of this together. I have a second example with a sole parent, depending on time, Dina. Happy to show that.
Before, if you can briefly show that, and then we'll go to Sarah and see how that resonates with her experience.
That's right. The example for sole parents may not be everybody's situation, because it is a parent on parenting payment. And of course, not all sole parents in Australia are receiving parenting payment, but many of them are receiving family payments, family tax benefit A and B. So this is an example of a sole parent who can earn the median wage. That's kind of halfway up the distribution. For women, that's around about 50 to 60,000 a year. So it's not a high wage. With two children under 5. And so a sole parent is receiving parenting payment, is also receiving family tax benefit, parenting payments in which includes. And so those are very important contributions to household income, of course. But as our sole parent goes to work 1 day a week, 2 days a week, 3 days a week, and so on, we want to increase workforce participation. There's a net childcare cost, which is the dark green component here, which is not that large because the childcare subsidy is helpful for this family. But you can see that we withdraw parenting payment and family tax benefit as her income rises, right, as she's going to work. So day one, effective tax rate's really only about 30%, so take-home pay is about 70%, not too bad. But you can see that for days 3, 4, and 5 of work, so you're moving from part-time to full-time, there's a very high, effective tax rate. You're not getting much extra from going to work. So it operates as a disincentive for work, even though we're benefiting from receiving those important payments in the household budget. I'll stop sharing that now, Dina, if that's...
Yeah, thanks, Miranda, and we'll come back and pick up some of the points that you've made. Turning to Sarah now, I'd be interested in your experience. You, as a mum of small kids, we know that raising children is expensive. Can you reflect on the contribution that family tax benefit makes to you and to your children?
Sure. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for allowing me to speak on this matter. And also I pay my respects to this beautiful land. I am a mother of small children, also a single mother, and I am not an Australian citizen. So when I became a single parent, family tax benefit was my sole income for quite some time. I am now employed, but that family tax benefit was what I solely relied on for everything. It did not seem like a heck of a lot when there was rent to pay, when there was children to feed and that kind of thing. I am very, very grateful that not being a citizen, I was eligible for that payment, because I was not eligible for single parent payment, job seeker, or any other payment like that. So certainly it was absolutely necessary for myself. I would certainly love to see some sort of change made that single parents who do reside in Australia can access that particular single parent payment as well, even while they're looking for work, while they're unemployed, just to have that bit of extra help, particularly if there are special circumstances that they cannot return to their home country. If their children were born over here and there's orders in place that they can't return to their birth mother's country. So certainly I think there needs to be change made in that kind of area if there are special circumstances. So yes, family tax benefit was certainly my sole income for quite some time.
Yeah, it must have been incredibly difficult, Sarah, to try to look after your kids.
Yeah, it certainly was. There was a lot of times where I didn't know if the rent would get paid, a lot of times where I certainly reached out to charities and asked for food vouchers and that kind of thing. So it certainly was a struggle. When I did become a single parent, I was actually pregnant, so quite heavily pregnant, with other children as well. So it wasn't as easy as, okay, get a job, return to the workforce. Particularly, I had been a stay-at-home mum, so I hadn't worked in Australia. So it wasn't as easy as, go get a job, go make some money, that kind of thing. It certainly was quite a difficult time.
Yeah, and you can really see how families in similar situations as yours can fall through the gaps between policies.
Absolutely. And there is also a lot of shame, a lot of, self-loathing that you're not doing a good enough job and that kind of thing as well, as well as the financial aspect. So, very challenging.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah.
Thank you.
I might turn to Anne now. Hearing Sarah, we see the importance of payment like family tax benefit. But overall, in conversations about family payments, children are often absent or not emphasised when talking about supporting families with children. But we know how important these payments are. As Children's Commissioner, you've spoken with many children and their families. So why does a focus on children matter?
Thank you, Dina, and thank you for inviting me here. I'm joining you from the lands of the Camaragal people of the Eora Nations, and I'm delighted. This is my first BSL Talks, so I was very excited to be invited, and with fantastic to hear from Sarah in particular directly what it's like to be juggling all of these pressures. And of course, I am looking forward to learning so much from Miranda, because I am not an expert on tax benefits, but family tax benefits. But to your question about why should we focus on children, it's because poverty matters to children. And we know that 1 in 6 children live in poverty. In fact, you're more likely to be in poverty if you're a child in this country. And it really goes to what are the policy settings that create the conditions to help parents to raise their children well. Do we have those correct policy settings? Do we have processes of reviewing them and keeping them up to date? And I know that right now there are so many families struggling with that cost of living, and these things take a long time to review when it comes to tax policy and payments and so forth. So, I just feel that in Australia, it's like a lot of things with policy related to children and families. We really do lag the rest of the world. We're not keeping up with other developed countries. And my observation in my relatively short time in this role has been that policy is generally designed for the concerns of adults, and that children's unique needs are often overlooked. We saw that very starkly during COVID, but really we ignore child wellbeing at our peril, because if we're not focusing on making sure the policy settings are right to support children and to prevent problems early in life, then we are going to pay much more for those ambulances at the bottom of the cliff later on: child protection, youth justice, homelessness, and so forth. And just before, I'll share a little bit in a minute, Dina, about what I've heard from kids, because you've invited me to do that. But I wanted to say that just a general reflection that we're not accustomed to seeing child wellbeing and economic policy in the same sentence. This is quite an unfamiliar conversation to us. And then I think that's because historically children have been seen as the the responsibilities of their parents alone, and that the role of government in creating those conditions for raising children has been less well understood and has really been minimised, I think. So I really welcome this conversation, and I welcome learning myself much more about how these tax benefits work. But I think these are issues that are very important to children. So as to what I've heard from children and others, like Professor Sharon Bessel has talked to children, a number of academics have done research with children. I mean, basically we know that children experience poverty often in different ways to what adults do. And, I'm very conscious of Sarah's, your account of the struggles that the extent to which parents, really deny themselves in order to give their children everything. It's just terrible. But children often, we don't actually even, they won't necessarily say what they're seeing, but when they're given the opportunity to share their experiences, they will talk about the fact that they will often not ask for the things they need. They'll deprive themselves, just like they see usually their mothers depriving themselves, that they won't, and I'm talking here about food and clothes and school supplies and so forth. They don't want to be a burden on their parents, and parents in turn are very conscious of that. So there's a lot of stress and anxiety that this creates. Kids also talk about spending a lot of time alone with their parent, might be working multiple jobs, commuting long distances. So they're alone, or they're caring for younger siblings. So again, there are these sort of extra issues that kids experience. And it really, the relationships between the parent and the child can be affected. And of course, relationships are the very important context in which everything matters in terms of, for children, relationships are everything. So if these stresses that poverty creates erode the relationships that children have, then, this is where the problems and the lifelong harms can really begin. Consultations that I did last year for the new National Framework for Protecting Australia's Children, I went out and I asked, what is it that helps to keep children safe and well, and what gets in the way? What are the barriers and the challenges and so forth? So very wide open questions. And what I heard everywhere around the country, it was about the basics. It was about kids and their families talked about lack of access to housing or income security. They talked about not being able to, get the services that adults or children need, like mental health services and so forth, and not having enough for the basics like food, clothes, not being able to get public transport, that kind of thing. So these were the very strong messages that came out in response to a question, what is it that stops kids being safe and well? So these are critical risk factors for child safety. And that's the message out of the report we wrote called Keeping Kids Safe and Well. This is not about coming up with the latest parenting education program or something else. We need to focus right down on the basic systems of support from housing, housing and income security, but also those basic public services that these kids and their families are forced to rely upon. They don't have a choice. They have to go to whatever the health service is providing or whatever the public school is providing, or, and it's the disconnection, the fragmentation of those basic public services that exacerbates the basic issues of income insecurity that we face in this country. And really the stories, again and again, it was consistent across Australia with these groups of kids and their families that have complex needs, that really we don't have the policy settings right to be able to support them.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. And, we're focusing in on family payments, but as you say, that basic social infrastructure is so important, to ensure that everyone has access to basics, the material basics for a good life. We know what some of the challenges are, so perhaps we can shift focus to some ways forward. Miranda, from your perspective, what are the key reforms to family tax benefit that could remove some barriers to increasing hours of work, whilst also protecting families from with children from poverty?
Thanks, Dina. So, of course, what we're talking about here is just income, but as we heard from Anne, the basics are important, and from Sarah's experience as well. So adequacy is important, and caring for our children. And made the point that there is this idea that somehow it's mostly the family's responsibility. Now, of course, we do obviously value that support by families and in the private home. But we all need to understand, especially in an era of population aging and declining fertility, that actually children are tremendously important in themselves and as a part of our kind of general society and economy. So we should be sharing the cost of care. So just to put that in perspective, and the other thing, just before making a couple of more specific suggestions about design, the other thing I would emphasize is that we should be looking to design a policy that would support the capabilities or the sort of life course well-being, both of mothers, of parents, and of children, obviously. And that involves thinking about long-term consequences of current policy settings, as well as responding to the immediate income needs that families have or crisis that needs to be addressed. And I totally agree with the idea of joining up some of these pieces as well. The issues that I identified, the kind of sort of high effective taxes or disincentives to work that arise because of the interactions of different policies. It's the interaction of the tax rate structure and the transfer payments, the means testing and the use of a couple unit, where we're talking about a couple, that sort of tight targeting of those payments that generates that economic effect. So if we think about what are our policy goals, obviously supporting children and families for the long term, and that also means investing in supporting women back into work, at the right level with convenient and suitable childcare support and income support. One possibility for couple families is that we look at the unit that we're talking about. So at the moment, we income test our payments on joint income of a couple. So the primary earner who's already working, we economists use that language of primary earner, or we might say breadwinner traditionally, and the second earner who might have been at home but is seeking to re-enter the labour market. So we could possibly income test that by looking at the income of the second earner, just the individual, instead of the joint income of the family. We could taper it so that the income testing is less steep. So we kind of reduce, or ideally, potentially, at least a core of the payment be universal. So tight income testing was actually introduced in the late 1980s and then tightened further in the 1990s. Historically, we always had some universality, some element of the payment that went to all families with children. Now, the solution for people who are worried about fairness at the top, rich families getting the payment, is that we tax the payment back. So we include it in income and just tax it. So that's another approach, rather than doing this very tight means testing that we do at the bottom. Adequacy, I think, is the third element, that we've got a lot of complexity in the interaction of these payments with other settings, including child support, which is not always paid to families, but the system often assumes a payment is made and thereby reduces people's benefits. So these interactions need close examination.
Thanks, Miranda. And it would be good to get some indication from the audience, perhaps in the chat, about that tension between the universal and taxed or targeted. Get get some indication of what people think, how people think payments should be designed.
Dina, I might jump in with one more comment. Sorry to interrupt you, but it might be interesting to the audience to realise that 100 years ago, when beginning of federation, there were a lot of children in poverty, and it was actually quite an important part of federal government policy, at least to think about child allowance of some kind. That was our first child endowment in the early part of the century. And not only that, but the cost of caring for children was recognised in the national accounts. The important contribution that was made at that time. So it is just interesting to think 100 years later, we have we're much wealthier country, but we still have these issues of poverty and security over the life course that we might want to rethink those things.
Now that's really important, I think, to look back at our history, because we can sometimes learn things from doing that. I might turn now to Anne. From your perspective, how best should families with children be supported to meet the costs of raising children?
Well, of course, I agree completely with Miranda because she knows how the nuances work. But can I just say that I was really interested, Miranda, in what you just said about 100 years ago. I mean, just really to reflect on the fact that I think culturally, that's a sign to me that we've lost sight of children, that we don't have those measures in place. And one of the things that I've really been trying to elevate to more public attention is the fact that wherever I turn, children are not a national policy priority in this country. And this is what we're talking about today, is actual evidence of that. So we can't lose sight of children or the cost of raising children. And while I don't know what Miranda knows in terms of the actual tax policy, I wanted to just say a little bit about targeting generally, if I could, Dina, versus sort of a universal approach. I mean, my observation over the years has been that targeting very tight targeting has a lot of traps in that people miss out, basically, if you just put all your eggs in the targeting basket. And what targeting, I think, works best when it's on a base of policy settings that really recognise the value of children, firstly, and that's a cultural value, and a base that recognises what's needed to keep children safe and well and provide for their health, development and well-being. And unless we're having those conversations, unless we're looking at how those issues like the well-being of children, how it's connected to economic policy settings, we completely miss out. We miss the point, right? We don't notice it unless we proactively have that conversation. And it is my hope that the Treasurer's promise of a well-being budget will include the idea of child well-being at its core, and that we'll start to focus much more deliberately on what it takes to ensure child well-being, what are the economic policy measures that will allow for that, and what are and to acknowledge the realistic costs of raising children, which goes to a question of value. I mean, if unless we are proactive about this, we're really saying it's not my problem, it's raising children is someone else's problem, and they need to find the ways to do it. So having a sort of a strong base of universality, I have seen work in other policy areas very well, where you can then provide extra for those who need additional support. And that idea of proportionate universalism or targeting on a stronger universal base, it appears to me to be a way to go that properly recognises the value of children.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. And now I'll turn to Sarah before we open up for questions. Sarah, it sounds like family tax benefit, given that was the only payment you were eligible for, made a real difference to you and your children. What policy changes would you suggest to improve things for families like yours?
Absolutely. I mean, it really was the only income. It was the only money coming in, and it was what I used to keep a roof over my children's head, and keep them fed. So, as I said earlier, it certainly didn't feel like it was enough in terms of once the rent was paid, sometimes there wasn't any left if there was an additional bill. Or I certainly would like to see a policy where the amount is changed for specific circumstances, like my circumstances, in terms of I have to stay in this country because of my children. I cannot take them to the country where I was born, where I would get more help and support. So I would certainly like to see a policy where there are some special circumstances. It's not just, okay, you want more money or you feel you should be eligible. It's very dire circumstances. And while I'm trying to get on my feet, even some more support and help to look for work, particularly because I had been out of work for so long, being a stay-at-home mother, and the fact that, it became a legal matter where family court was involved and the children had to stay here. They had to reside here. And I was certainly the main breadwinner, if you like, the parent that was providing everything for the children. So I would love to see some special circumstances in place for even family tax benefit if you're not eligible for anything else, or even special circumstances for single parent payment when you're not a citizen, but there's no other choice and that you do have to stay here. Just while you're getting on your feet, trying to get back into work, some sort of safety net like that would be really, really amazing.
And Sarah, often there's the assumption that child support is paid, and that has an impact, as Miranda said, on the level of family tax benefit paid. Can you make some comment about the experience of receiving
Sure. I think child support is, I'm trying to think of the word, it's not very reliable, and I also think it is quite unfair in terms of the party that has to pay the child support. They're able to keep changing their income estimate. So, payments go up and down. You may see a payment one month. You may see a payment every month, and then you don't see a payment for a while. So there certainly needs to be some sort of change to that where, you do an income estimate and you can't keep changing it, and you just have an amount that you have to pay. So certainly my family tax benefit was affected because the other party was changing their income estimate frequently.
And that can make it really hard to budget or even know how much.
Oh, absolutely. Like I say, you can go months without even receiving anything, and it's very difficult when it is, you're relying on this money. There's no other support. So it is very difficult, and I feel that needs an overhaul where I know in the country where I am from, the system means that you provide an income estimate, or they take it off your last tax, financial year, and you're stuck with that for the year, so you can't keep changing it. So to me, that feels more fair. That's for sure.
There's a lot of, I think part of the challenge with talking about something like family tax benefit is that it is so incredibly complex because it's interaction with other policy settings.
Yes.
So
yes,
it can make
right.
obviously the experience of trying to rely on a payment is difficult, but it also is challenging when we're trying to discuss it, which is why it's really great that we've got Miranda here to provide some of the detail. We might go to some questions. We've got a little bit of time. The first question, I think, is around, which perhaps I can guess the answer to, but we'll ask it anyway. Is there a conversation to be had about the cost of raising children within the cost of living discourse? There's a lot of issue, cost of living is high on the agenda. So what's the role of the cost of living, of raising children and cost of living? And as a follow-up, should the National Children's Commissioner with Professor Stewart have a right to be heard when Fair Work Australia sets the minimum wage? So Anne and Miranda and Sarah, if you'd like to pipe up, perhaps to Anne first.
Well, that's a great idea, isn't it? I always like to be heard. Look, I definitely think we should focus more on the costs of raising children as part of the general increase in costs. And I'll just share a story. I did a media interview this morning on apparently there's been a massive increase in the numbers of parents who would otherwise have separated into separate households who are now separated under the same roof. And there's a Centrelink code that apparently that goes to separated under the same roof. But it's gone, been a massive increase in the last couple of years. Now, this to me clearly points to obviously the housing costs that we all know about. And I certainly saw as I travelled the country over the last year that the housing unaffordability in areas where usually, the low wage earner families would be able to rent something. I mean, they're just not able to anymore. That was shown very starkly in the Four Corners episode, ABC Four Corners last week. So that's clearly a reason why, part of the reason why more couples are now separated under the same roof, forced to do that. But it's not just that. It's all of these things that we're discussing. Housing is one factor, but it does go to how do you manage to afford the costs of raising children, and when couples separate and Sarah's in that position, there are a whole lot of complex and increased costs that you have to manage, and if it's a couple that's wants to parent children from across two households, which is what most people end up often doing now, is a lot of extra cost. So you can immediately see why there are couples choosing to stay in the same house and be separated. But imagine at the very best the tension that they're under in those circumstances, being unable to get on with their lives, and then the transfer of the lack of well-being of the parents to the pressure on the children. We know that the well-being of parents affects children greatly. But at the worst sort of situation, and I saw these situations around the country, it's where it's actually dangerous for those people to live together. I met many young mums in my consultations who had escaped violent relationships and with babies and toddlers, and were now couch surfing because they were homeless, right? So, I'm very worried. I didn't know this, but a journalist told me that there's been this massive increase of people now separated under the same roof. And that goes to your question, Dina, about the costs of raising children.
Yeah, so very interesting aspect. And I know that people can be really caught in situations because they face that terrible choice of, of poverty, basically, and homelessness unless they stay, which is less than ideal, much less than ideal for everyone. Miranda, what are your thoughts about the cost of putting this discussion within a cost of living context?
Look, the cost of living question, and I certainly think Anne Hollonds should have a voice before the Fair Work Commission. The cost of living issue raises the question of indexation of payments and keeping up with CPI. So that's obviously one aspect of that. And Australia does index a number of our payments. However, indexation has actually been frozen, as we know, over a period of years, and the income thresholds for these payments were also frozen. Meaning that they really did not go up in real terms for the last decade. So the real cost, the real benefit from these payments actually has been declining. And because the thresholds have not been indexed, the number of families who benefit from the payments is also declining. It's, as I said, it's already below half of families with children in Australia. I don't think that a payment like this should be about the cost of housing. I think housing policy is obviously a massive issue in Australia and is a different question. So what we should be thinking about with these kinds of payments is something that we think is a suitable cash payment to recognise costs of children. And we do that to some extent in the design of these payments in terms of smaller or larger amounts depending on the age of the children. Older children tend to be more costly. I should say as well, I do think it's very important. So 100 years ago, we had a family wage setting. So through the 20th century, of course, we've moved away from that and we moved to individual wages, and women are, for our own economic security, I think this is the right approach, are in the workforce as individuals and can build their own economic wages and savings and so on. And that's important. But what we've lost in the last 2 decades, I think, is a recognition of the cost of children as being a part of that overall cost of living. So it's that we should be calibrating. And look, just briefly, Dana, just to add, of course, there are other policies, and the two big ones that intersect are childcare subsidy, so funded childcare essentially, and paid parental leave. And it is really great to see the government moving towards stronger paid parental leave for a longer period. I still think it's not long enough. And also moving towards universalising childcare. In my personal view, it's still not universal enough. So I would tend towards universalising with taxing back rather than targeting quite the way we do.
Thanks, Miranda. Another question here from someone who is a single mum and highlighting the change that came in 2013 around parenting payment single, so that then people were obliged to go on to job seeker payment once their youngest child turned 8. She says, my question is there any discussion about looking at the impact that the 2013 reforms have had on children living in poverty? So really looking at sole parents who are perhaps on job seeker at a lower rate rather than parenting payment. Anyone like to make a comment about that?
Look, maybe I'll just jump in briefly, but I'm sure Anne and others have more substantial. So that is absolutely right. There is no doubt that being required to move on to job seeker, what was New Start, now job seeker, really pushed families with older children, so parents with older children, into much lower incomes. We know how low and inadequate job seeker is, and in fact there's been recent studies by the Treasury, by the Parliamentary Budget Office, of who is living on job seeker these days, and we actually know that there are many women, there are many sole parents, mostly women, and there are many older women also relying on job seeker, and it is clearly inadequate for that purpose.
Would you like to make a comment, either Sarah or Anne?
Well, I certainly see, I guess, the purpose of job seeker in terms of you get put onto it once your youngest child I think, turns 8. I guess the flip side is that's seen as, okay, well, your child is old enough, they should be at school. While you're at school, certainly, your child is at school, certainly you could get some employment then. I guess the other flip side is, as we know, as children get older, the expenses rise. So certainly it's, I guess, designed for older children. But the ironic thing is, as children get older, of course, the expenses rise. So it's certainly not adequate, I don't believe.
Thanks, Sarah. What about you, Anne?
Look, I'll just comment very briefly, picking up on some things Miranda was talking about with the sort of transfer of parents onto job seeker. It just seems to be generally we focus on what it is the adults are or the parents are doing or not doing. You know, are they working? Are they not? You know, it's all about the parents and getting them back to work, which is understandable because we want to reduce the welfare bill. But children themselves are only ever in focus, as to my observation, as a burden or as a drag on the participation of adults, you know, in the workforce. And that was really stark when that Parents Next program was brought in, you know, like where we just didn't really have a conversation about what are the needs of children and how can we get the right balance of, you know, trying to encourage and provide the incentives for parents to be working, which we know is beneficial to children in a broad sense, but also then balancing up the need for the care that particularly young children and you know, we're talking young children here now. I mean, they need a lot of time with their primary carer and just putting them in after school care or, you know, childcare or whatever really does not really compensate for that nurturing that they get, you know, with their parent. So I think we really need to kind of shift and put children back into the conversation. I'm sort of repeating myself now, but that I think this part of it shows that really we miss that step. We're just talking about what are the adults doing, not how is that affecting children.
And what you pointed out, Anne, is that often people experiencing poverty also experience time poverty, particularly single mums, because you know, the pressure to work can reduce their time paying attention to the children, and so they're caught in this kind of trap. And I don't know if you'd want to comment on that, Sarah.
Oh, absolutely, yes. The mum guilt, as they call it, is absolutely real, particularly when you're back at work and you would rather be with your children and you want to be there to witness things at school. You want to be there to help with homework. Often you're not getting in from work, then after school care pickup until tea time. So absolutely, there is a huge sense of mum guilt because children absolutely, that they come first, and you certainly want them to be able to you know, not miss out on certain things, but you often can't be there. So yeah, it's a huge thing, is mum guilt.
And it's I suppose it's the policies and systems that put particularly women in the position of feeling that pressure and that guilt.
Yes.
We've got this other final question. If we're very quick, we can do it. This is from Therese Edwards from Council for Single Mothers and Their Children. What does the panel think of an independent social commission to recommend income support? Should we have an inquiry?
It's an interesting question, isn't it? So one could read that in two ways. One is that it's something more permanent, and one is that it's a review or an inquiry is appropriate. Certainly on the second, as I say, it's a long time since we've really thought carefully about the structure of our payments for children. And I think that it would be timely to do a review into the design and taper rates, units, adequacy and all those things of payments for children in the context of Australia's declining fertility. As I said, our fertility is 1.6, which is significantly below replacement. We're very good at migration in Australia. We're a strong multicultural society, and obviously that's fantastic. But we still actually, even, through a tax lens or an economic lens, we need to support having children in Australia, I think. So I think that would be worth a review. There is one other question in the chat about the cost of children. The Australia Institute of Family Studies has done a number of studies, and there are others internationally, about the fact that older children do cost more. It even comes down to how much food they eat, and how big their feet are, how often they need shoes. That sort of thing as well. So just to answer that question.
Yeah, and I think anyone who's had older kids know that they're more expensive in all sorts of ways. And did you want to make a comment?
Yes, just on Teresa's suggestion. Look, I've come at this in a slightly different way. I mean, looking across all the areas of policy, this being one of them, that affect the well-being of children. This is an area that really has lacked coordination forever, and hence we've got such little progress in terms of all the difficulties that we're trying to fix and remediate. So I've actually recommended a multidisciplinary cross-sector child wellbeing council that would of experts from across sectors, across disciplines, to help government to work on some of these very thorny problems. And so that would be a standing kind of council that I'd like to see, that is used a bit like we've got the Respect at Work Council now, we've got the Women's Economic Equality Task Force, we've got these bodies. We're recognising that you need to get people with different lenses on a problem around a table. And I think government could really benefit from the many experts who understand the evidence of what works and what doesn't work.
Thanks, Anne. We're out of time, coming up to 1 o'clock. So thank you, everyone, for a fantastic discussion, particularly to Miranda, Anne and Sarah.
Thank you.
We need to keep the wellbeing of children in sharp focus, as Anne reminds us, and to support families like Sarah's, we also need to address the policy traps that ensnare women and their children in the intersections of work, care and social security, as Miranda said. So let's keep the conversation going. You can see follow us on Twitter and stay in touch for updates. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Thanks now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.